agriculture through commercialization for sustainable food system transformation. My name is Julie Howard. I'll be your moderator for today's session. I'm a senior advisor at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. My own interest in scaling stems from my work with USAID and Feed the Future from 2011 to 2014. There, I led a team that conceptualized and implemented USAID's first ever scaling up an agriculture strategy. In the years since, I've been involved with a number of efforts with the scaling community to keep reflecting, learning, and advancing our knowledge about scaling. These include a major conference convened with Purdue University and the African Development Bank in 2016, a subsequent guidebook on scaling, co-authored by Larry Cooley and me, and policy discussions at the World Food Prize and African Green Revolution forums. Many of this week's speakers have been a part of those efforts, and for me, this webinar series represents a great next installment to these community-focused practical learning events. All of you who are participating in the webinars are very welcome to join our scaling community of practice. And for more information, the website couldn't be simpler, scalingcommunityofpractice.com. So I'd like to spend the next few minutes reviewing the webinar series and some of the key points that came out of the first two webinars. This webinar series focuses on the pathway from innovation to impact, particularly through commercialization with the private sector. And importantly, the webinar focuses on experiences and lessons from commercialization of innovations related to food safety and nutrition. Up to now, food safety and nutrition innovations, I think, have been such a relatively minor part of the global agricultural research and innovation portfolio, but that's changing. Today, there's rising interest given new evidence that poor diets and foodborne illnesses are a, if not the leading cause of early mortality worldwide. The UN Food Systems Summit that will be convened in September is drawing a big red priority circle around the issues of ensuring safe, nutritious, and affordable food, and asking some hard questions. Why aren't we spending more in this area, given the imperative to make much faster progress? One of the key questions facing the new 1CG system is what priority will be given to nutritious foods and food safety as new programs and collaborations are developed. So the discussions in this webinar series this week are so highly relevant to these global conversations that are going on right now. So let me just pull out a few of the key takeaways from the webinars on Tuesday and Wednesday. The first webinar on Tuesday focused on describing the development and spread of three technologies: AflaSafe to reduce aflatoxin contamination, PICS bags to improve crop storage, and biofortified crops to improve the nutritional value of commonly consumed foods. We heard from the research leads and their private sector partners, and we heard from scaling expert Larry Cooley, who gave the keynote address on Tuesday. Larry's slide, let's see if I can bring it up here. Let's see. Share screen. There, okay. So Larry's slide, I think, to me, captures the key dilemma that we have. So on the left-hand side, you see steadily expanding bars, which we can suppose represent increasing adoption of a technology. So this is the customary project view, and we who are researchers, we grew up with this. And we think adoption by innovation is expanding at a brisk pace. All is good. But Larry points out that this approach just ignores the denominator of the problem, and that is the size of the need. That's this vast white space that takes up most of the graph. So most innovations are addressing only a very small portion of the overall need. And by contrast, the scaling view and the view that the private sector takes naturally focuses on the size of the denominator. The private sector focuses on the size of the market. What's the potential for the marketing? And designs with scale in mind from day one. And that difference in perspective, the project versus scaling, is where the potential for very fruitful collaboration between research institutions and the private sector lies. So let me borrow one more slide from Larry. Let's see. There we go. A lot of our conversations over these past 2 days have focused on the challenge of intermediation. What is this gear? What is this pathway to bridge the great white space between innovation and impact at scale? Who are the most important players, and what are the most important pieces of the gear, of the bridge? So private sector and research partners on Tuesday and yesterday reflected on what could have been done better. What's our experience been so far? And so here are some of the observations and some of the questions raised. So they said it's so important to have baseline evidence about the effectiveness in the innovation and show how it's important. A figure that stuck with many of us, 40% of all liver cancers in Africa are attributable to aflatoxin contamination. How could we bring private sector and regulators into the conversation earlier? To engage private sector interests, it's critical to demonstrate the value proposition, know the size of the market, recognize the need for continuing market expansion. How to keep a continual focus on costs, reducing the costs of production, of marketing, of simplifying the innovation. This is not natural for researchers who always want to create the best, the most effective innovation possible. So the participants, the speakers noted the importance of research organizations having intellectual property and licensing agreements in order to identify serious manufacturers who can produce a quality product. And private sector and researchers noted the need to continue to adapt the product to meet the needs of the expanding and evolving market. So PICS bags began with cowpea and then branched out to other crops. PICS began in West Africa, then expanded to other regions. So a very exciting set of discussions on Tuesday. And the second webinar yesterday built on these first day's discussions, but focused on the enabling environment needed to take innovations to scale. Okay. Ndidi and Winelli spoke of the importance of leveraging diverse partners through an ecosystem approach that can address multiple factors and is built for sustainability, she said. And these ecosystem partners, including farmers, industry associations, government, even media, have to be in the discussion with research institutions from the very beginning. Rodrigo Ortiz of AgResults spoke of the pay for results and prize competition models to incentivize the private sector to invest in high impact agricultural innovations. Along the way, they were able to identify gaps, barriers to commercialization, and address them. One of the most interesting things I thought, a major challenge was creating the foundation so that a market for premium aflatoxin-free maize could take off. And this involved developing standards, developing a feasible testing process, a distributed testing network, and outreach, advertising, and branding. So you eventually supported a diverse market and a significant price differential in the market for aflatoxin-free grain. We heard from directors of standards agencies and planning officials in Africa. Data, accountability, reliable systems, protocols, training all along the supply chain and consumer awareness are key, they said. The director of Kenya's Bureau of Standards spoke of the importance of establishing the quality of the product to the consumer and the need for standards agencies to take a holistic approach to understand and address sources of aflatoxin contamination from farm through to post-harvest. The director of Ghana's standards authorities talked about linking innovations in aflatoxin testing and reduction to the major outcomes that are of interest to the government. I thought this was so interesting. He talked about in Ghana's very interested in expanding its maize exports in the region, given the new opportunities. Maize and other products contaminated with aflatoxins simply can't be exported. So this is the challenge, how to reduce aflatoxin contamination to increase exports. The directors, planning and statistics, standards, also talked about the importance of government investments to reduce risk and to create markets. So in Ghana, for example, the creation of a warehouse receipt system has served multiple purposes. It's a way for farmers to get finance with their stored grain as collateral. It's also a way to build aflatoxin awareness, testing and enforcement. And it's a link to markets for aflatoxin-free grain. So the director of planning in Malawi's Ministry of Agriculture spoke of the driving concern of his government to reduce micronutrient malnutrition, especially in children. And so the government has led with investments in research and marketing for key crops for fortified beans, orange flesh sweet potato, and cassava. They're financing research and taking on some of the risk associated with seed development and marketing, production, and scaling. And then the government procures these biofortified crops for school feeding and other institutional programs. So you begin to see the ecosystem being connected. So this brings us to today's final webinar in the series, and this focuses on the way forward. So we're going to reflect on the experiences and lessons we've reviewed over the past 2 days and discuss what does it all mean for the design of future research, development, and commercialization initiatives aimed at improving food safety and nutrition in 21st century food systems. And we've got a wonderful slate of speakers for you today. First, a keynote presentation, followed by a couple of panel discussions. So let me first introduce our keynote speaker, Professor Laurette Dubé. Professor Dubé is full professor at the Desautels Faculty of Management at McGill University and the founder and scientific director of the McGill Center for the Convergence of Health and Economics. The center is an initiative to push the boundaries of science to tackle major societal and economic challenges. And I just love that tagline. Professor Dubé is, to me, a living example of a boundary spanner. To her roles at McGill, she brings her initial training as a nutritionist, but she also holds degrees in finance, in marketing, and also behavioral decision-making and consumer psychology. I can't think of a better person to deepen our understanding of the major topics that we broached yesterday: the need for an ecosystem approach, the role of data in creating and sustaining this ecosystem of partners and institutions, and in informing and advancing effective innovations. Professor Dubé, over to you. And please, audience, in case we have time for a few question and answers, please post these in the chat box. Thank you. Laurette.
Can I share my screen? I'm having problems sharing my screen. Oh. I may need to get the backup for sharing my screen if it's okay.
Okay, we are sharing for you. We are sharing the screen for you.
Okay, perfect. Okay, so if everybody see, first of all, thanks Julie and Abdu. I'm very pleased and honored to be here at this IITA Gates webinar series, and it's for me, it is a bit being back to where it all started. As you may or may not know, a lot of what we will be talking about today, this convergence approach to innovation and even going further, convergence economy, was very much started with Prabhu Pingali at the time when Prabhu was, the Gates was starting the agriculture division, and we work 2010, 2011 very extensively in kind of theorizing a bit about this convergence, and we had a special feature in PNES in 2012 that was accompanied by a major convergence workshop in Delhi in 2012, to be followed after by a Rockefeller 3 days workshop at Bellagio in the same year. That was the time that John McDermott was taking the position of at CGIAR, Agriculture for Nutrition. And since then, next slides, please. Since then, we have been advancing this approach of both innovating in a way that brings the various science and technology pipeline together, but the pipeline in the various sectors and all of the above being targeted to providing affordable, nutritious, and appealing food that everybody can afford. In 2000, later on, 2 years ago, when the Godon Secretariat moved from Oxford to McGill, we had been developing those platforms in India, in Canada. Here, the whole agri-food sector has been selected as one of the area for investment, with very much large-scale government and private sector investment. And we are working very closely to embrace innovation from that perspective. And when Godon moved to McGill, we wanted to do more work in Africa. That's when we reconnected with John. And he introduced us to Hanajit and his team for the AflaSafe. And it was 2 years ago. And one of the things that was very fascinating and interesting for me was to see to what extent they were already in the way they were scaling, first of all, bringing to market and scaling the AflaSafe. They were also doing a lot of what I will talk about, this Convergent, working not just with the farmer, but working also in creating a whole ecosystem around in terms of formal and informal food and so on and so forth. So that is why it has been this FCI Africa. It is still very much informal, but very much real also, between McGill, Godon, IITA, and the Pittsburgh Supercomputing Center, and the Ghana University. We have been hosting in 2019 a ministerial meeting where Ghana declared that Convergence Innovation will be the strategy moving forward. So what I will try to do now in this 20-25 minutes is to give you a very brief overview of what is this FCI Africa we are talking about. Some example of related projects to AflaSafe and beyond that we are currently articulating. And then I will talk about what I call the next generation approach to scaling up from this ecosystem and person-centered perspective. Next slide, please. So we can go this one, next one, yeah. So here, just a key point, talking about when we talk about the complex, the grand challenge and so on, it is systems of systems that we are talking about. And when we talk about scaling innovation from that ecosystem and societal perspective, bringing in this understanding that it is not at the two extremes, the small scale farmer and then the global. It is all of the various jurisdictions in the various sectors in government, private sector, and community that are at play in defining the context. And the other point that I want to make here is keeping the person, the human, in the middle of this, because no system transformation can happen unless human beings engage into those, whether it is as consumer, as farmer, or otherwise, do integrate this into the way we do things. Next slide, please. So what I just showed was part of this special feature in PNAS, but essentially the point that we talk about here at the core is that we cannot look at economic outcome on the one hand and health and nutrition on the other hand, and then somewhere out there is environment and climate change. So the idea is really, can we individual and ecosystem level, can we look at this new balance between those three criteria and not just one being a constraint for the other? And in terms of what does it mean in terms of the food per se, this flower there took us about 3 years to develop, in the sense that it is not just the food that people and society need for food safety and nutrition and so on. And it's neither not the one that marketing and commercial are looking for food that consumers want. It is also the three other aspects are very important. The food that people are willing and able to pay for, whether it is society or client, food that the planet can sustain, but also the food that the farmer and the value chains are able and willing to produce. So as we move forward, next slide, please. You see here that this producing food and innovating at this convergence sweet spot require not just agricultural innovation in breeding and food safety or biofortification at the agricultural product level, but you get all those different silos here that have to be brought together around concrete projects. And that's why one of the things, next slide, please. One of the things we will be talking about is that the ocean cannot be boiled more than one drop at a time, and being very, very domain specific. This is a slide that I have adapted from an earlier presentation by Abdul in December FCI Africa workshop. And the point that I want to make here is that it's not just a holistic response to complex problems. It is really science and data driven. And that is why here, that was a diagram that Abdul was having, and this is the typical multi-criteria diagram that we have to put kind of what is the overall balance. And you see where we are now. If I invest on the innovation, you get the impact on the other aspects, whereas what we are trying to achieve is really, can we really move toward this as much synergy as possible. And next slide, please. So if we recap here, and that's one of the key part over when we talk about intermediation and transformation in complex system, a good part of it is really having the data and the governance architecture that can provide information on the whole of what we are achieving or trying to achieve, but also what does it mean in each of those domains. So the impact is complex. The data are multi-model, multi-scale, varying in openness and standardization. Some of those data are open, others are private. But what is very relevant now is that with this era of Industry 4.0, so where it's not just Internet of Things for the person, it's also Internet of Things for the farm and for the whole chain. So there is capacity really to see to what extent we can inform and embed into innovation or action on the ground as much as the information as possible, so that no one has to lead the whole ocean. It's really understanding how it gets together. Next slide, please. So here, when Godin, this is from Godin, as you may know, that was the type of data that respondent was saying that are needed, and it's yes, the geospatial and so on, but also market data, health or other. And one of the key building blocks it was Dutch originally founded, but this data cube that Godon has been building as capacity over the years is an important building block in moving forward. Next slide, please. So here I want to make the point that when we talk about who is creating this ecosystem, the point is that it's really to think of it that nothing will happen just by chance. There has to be a design of how can we equip the actors with the appropriate data. And then and this appropriate data, it's a combination of the data that are used for commercial value creation, as well as data from public or data from that are collected by researchers or by other in any survey and so on. So the question and the point that we make in moving forward is that there has to be a significant thinking and capacity building here, which is not just building road or building physical infrastructure, building the capacity for information to support transformation is important. Next slide, please. And that gets me to the more directly related to the work here with IITA and others as this FCI Africa consortium. Next slide, please. So that is also a slide from Abdu that can be related here within the projects that we talk about, which was the biofortification, the AFLA-SAFE, and the PICS, I believe, for the packaging. So if you start looking at those, are three separate, previous slides, please. Okay, if you start looking at those in terms of not three distinct projects, but three components taking different entry points that can be connected with other innovation and so on and so forth, so that you get those sustainable change at scale. The best request for AFLA-SAFE, nutrition cannot start if you don't have a safe ingredient in moving forward. Next slide, please. This is here one of the key parts coming back to the platform earlier is that, and John McDonough would recognize this slides here, we need to find a way so that everybody can do what they do in their day job, respect their own value and so on and so forth, but build common capacity. And that's really why we are thinking of this as various projects or various capacity we build together that ultimately all contribute to the outcome. Next slide, please. So here, I was talking over the years that we have been building. We started with the Global Pulse platform, launched in 2016, the Year of Pulse. In Canada, I was talking about the work that we are doing with the industry leader. The same in Quebec. You will recognize the different jurisdictions here. Is that this notion that transformation cannot happen either individual or global. It is all of the above that we are talking here. And the three, so those platforms here it is FCI Ghana, but currently most of the work is shifting to, not shifting, it's Ghana, Nigeria, and Burkina Faso. But the idea here is that the same three core capabilities are developed as we are evolving those and also supporting those platforms. And here I talk about digital and data, the capacity being this digital backbone that I'm emphasizing on because it is very much missing currently in our approach. The human-centered I repeat, and we never do it enough. Systems cannot be transformed if individuals operating within this are not integrating this. And then the human backbone that I call Dominic, for instance, is one of those consultants that have already integrated a lot of this convergence and can act between the academia and the research and the actors on the ground. And the diagram to the right, that also is the outcome of a very long process, understanding that transformation can start at any entry point here, like you have primary agriculture, pulse, dairy, and so on. But unless, as soon as you move away from beyond the staple food, those agricultural commodities become ingredients into food product and so on. And the challenge is really back to my flower, is that how can we, by design, moving in the direction of having this balance between the economic and so on. Next slide, please. So this is here, this is again, Abdul having kind of mapped the ecosystem within which IITA is evolving, and it is easy to put in a supply chain structure like this. The challenge is that, no, not yet, is that to what extent on any specific enterprise in this convergence projects build up, what would make sense for who should be brought there, what is the value created for the partner, and conversely. So next slide. So here, that is, you may have seen this earlier in the session, because that is also the notion, and that's a bit what I was talking about. The business case is to be done for everyone, for the farmer, for the aggregator, but also for the persons themselves. And here the question are how can we address this? And that is why, if I am to go in terms of the way we are defining our alliance at this point in time for harmonizing conservation of biodiversity, economic practice for economic resilience and health, and data-driven shared investment and on-the-ground collaboration to create a convergence economy. I will come back to this after. To enhance environmental and inclusive growth and so on. And the initiative aims to harness state-of-the-art private sector and institutional know-how and investment to have this ultimate convergence objective, but taking as entry point the relation between biodiversity and agriculture. So if we continue, next slide. So the actual partner that are engaged, I'm sure you have heard about Harvest when Ranajit was talking. When Ranajit was talking about the initiative per se, but we also have been having the other partner that bring capacity for food innovation, as well as various sensors, if we are to trace the value creation process. Next slide, please. So here, that gives an example. This is the type of testing system we are planning to integrate into ongoing deployment of the AFLA-SAFE in various geography, but complementing with this ability to trace whether it's the quality or the safety and so on. Here, This is very briefly the next slide, please. This one here, it is a project that is about equipping policymakers to be able to, policymaker and industry leadership also, to see, can we understand the actual, we are doing this for maize and groundnuts, and what are the feedback loops from a private sector perspective, and from this then moving from a policy and investment perspective. So this is basically building on system dynamics and computational, but in a way that is very much anchored into action. Next slide. This one here, very briefly, in fact, this is something that we are doing in Montreal, and the idea is really to see to what extent could we really take, that was in response to a call for a secondary city in West Africa, but the idea here is to see to what extent if we look at our community within cities and city within states and within countries and so on, to what extent then can we provide digital support to the various points of decision and innovation? Next slide. So here I'm getting, in the last 5 minutes maybe, I'm getting to this next generation. Next slide here. So I will let you look into this, and I may read briefly, but the point is that when we talk about the convergence economy, is that currently as society, we invest tremendously in health and healthcare, whether it is for COVID or whether it is for chronic disease and so on. And this health and healthcare is kind of outside of what we do in the way we create other aspects of our economy and society. The other piece also, when support is given for inclusive growth or for green and so on, this is kind of disconnected in some way, one from the other. So what we are saying here is that can we, if we take a country, a city and so on, could we look at how we build synergy between those parallel efforts in a way that create more convergence? And the other point also that is important to make is that the quote unquote develop and developing worlds, we are on the same planet. So it is really important to not doing in the developing context, the Western pattern of development that we know has done a lot of good, but also has a lot of limitation. Next slide. So here, back to what we are talking about is that it's not only the silo of innovation within each sector, but to what extent can we kind of see how they can complement each other. And this notions here, just to come back to the notion of the human being at the center, but this combination of innovation by actors that are on all sides of the commercial or social debate. Next slide. Okay, so here, just briefly, I think Nidhi yesterday was talking about the importance of branding and so on and so forth, and it is the case. And the question, what a brand does, it's an identity that one person relates to. And the point, that was some work in the context of the India platform, to what extent can there be more of this understanding of the identity or the communication power from the beginning of when we address food nutrition security, even in the most vulnerable population. Next slide, and I'm almost done. So this one here is really, and that is also something continuing on the context of branding. We were saying, how can we really have an ecosystem approach to this? And the idea is to say, okay, if I am part of this ecosystem that produce sustainable nutrition, safety, and so on, what does it mean for me as a farmer? What does it mean if I am an aggregator and so on, the government, and investor and so on? So that is kind of the one part when we look at data-driven and science-based. We really need to move toward both having the science and the relationship, but also the metrics, and make sense within the context of each actor. I should be almost done. Next one. So here, back to
running out of time. Can you please wrap up?
Yeah, that is the last slide here.
Okay.
Back to this digital ecosystem. You have the various pieces there, but what is important is that there has to be some standard interface of some sort, both between the digital, but most importantly, between the digital and the action and the innovation on the ground. And thank you very, very much.
Thank you so much, Laurette. You've given us so much to think and talk about. And I know I'm going to be diving into your journal articles after this seminar is over. And I suspect many of the folks on this seminar will be interested in looking again at your webinar presentation. And I think the slides will be posted very quickly on the IATA site. So really, really thank you. I think you've sort of opened another dimension for us in our conversation. Yes, thank you. Well, so now I'd like to turn to our terrific group of panelists, and we've actually divided this next part of the webinar into two mini panels. The first panel is composed of key players on the ground, research institutions, farmers, the private sector, and finance organization, and then we'll have a second panel made up of development partners. So turning to the first panel, and again, both of these panels are going to address, what do we take out of the last 2 days of conversations and from Laurette's keynote address for the way forward? What are the lessons? What are the key takeaways? How do we apply that to the design of future research and commercialization innovations? So turning to the first panel, I'm just going to briefly introduce them all by names and affiliations. Then I'm going to pose a question to each in turn. And then after the second panel, I'm hoping will be open for a few Q&A from the audience. So please post these, continue to post these in the Q&A box. So I'm going to start with Dr. John McDermott, who is the director for CGIAR, Ag for Nutrition and Health program of the International Food Policy Research Institute. And then after, I'm going to turn to Mrs. Elizabeth Nsimidala. She is the president of the East Africa Farmers Federation and president of the Pan-African Farmers Organization. Next, we'll hear from Mr. Ibrahim Gorusa, who is the chief operating officer for Grow Africa at ADA NAPAD. And finally, Dr. Jonas Chiano, who was our keynote speaker yesterday, and it's also a panelist for us today. He is the chief agricultural economist and the coordinator for technologies for African agricultural transformation at the African Development Bank. So turning to John, this webinar is focusing, of course, on the implications of past experience and lessons for the design of future initiatives aimed at improving food safety and nutrition. And you really, John, you've led CG's premier program linking agriculture and nutrition since its inception in 2011. So please tell us in a nutshell a little bit about A4NH and its innovations. And then if you could discuss a little bit. Over the last few days, we've heard a number of suggestions about what research organizations might do differently to get to scaled and sustained outcomes through commercialization. These include engaging earlier with the private sector, having a private sector advisory committee, involving government agencies earlier, especially testing and standards agencies. And there was an observation that research agencies need people with different kinds of skills to make these connections with government and private sector work. And could you comment on some of these suggestions? And then last but not least, if you were designing A4NH today, what would you change and what would you keep the same and why? John, over to you. You've got about 6 minutes to answer that questions.
Thanks, Julie. So I'd like to kind of frame my response under 3 categories, I guess. So the first one is this welcome thinking that and focus on foods and diets rather than commodities, and look at what's happening in food systems. So food systems are transforming rapidly, fastest in Asia and Latin America, but pretty quickly in Africa as well. And what are the implications of that? And we often forget or don't focus enough on these transformations that are happening anyway. So the majority of our farmers now are net buyers of food. Diverse diets for households are purchased in markets, they're not grown. Large amounts of processed foods are bought and consumed everywhere in the continent, including quite remote areas. And the missing middle that we talk about, it actually exists. There are companies that move food around, that do wholesale. Maybe they could be strengthened, they probably need more support, but they're operating and they're figuring out what to do. Now, there's where I think policy and research is lagging quite a bit on these food system transformations, and there's some big changes needed. And yesterday I was talking to some policymakers from Uruguay, actually, who they raised the point that they think it's a big problem that the agriculture and health sectors don't have similar views on food system transformation. And it's really a problem for them. And I completely agree with them. So ag focuses more on the supply side. Health looks at diet transition and some health risks. But the joined up conversation between them is critical, and it hasn't really happened. And just as a microcosm of that, if you think about aflasafe and aflatoxins and their different perspectives, for aflatoxins, if you look at agriculture, we think this is a pretty big health risk. We talk about liver cancer and other things, that it's relatively big, but the health people are completely unimpressed with how big a health issue this is. They think malaria is a big health issue. They also think that foodborne diseases are a big health issue, but microbial contamination of perishables, not aflatoxins. And the order of magnitude of differences between those problems is 1,000-fold in terms of the people affected and morbidity and mortality. I think there is convergence between agriculture and health about what the big issues are with aflatoxins. And Julie and Lorette also pointed out, I mean, these are a big market risk for getting into higher value agriculture and for getting more income into farmers and processors and other actors that we want to benefit and raise GDPs. And the health sector will kind of come into that because they will respond, especially to urban consumers who have concerns about aflatoxin risks and things like that, to make regulations and things like that. So there'll be this market risk issue, I think, is a major convergence point. Now, we can talk about converging across the sectors, but you can't coordinate everything at the same time. So where to start? I would think a good place to start, and I've heard a number of things for the first couple of days, is between the ag, health, and the kind of industrial business sectors, those 3 sectors, get a common agreement, I think, about the future vision, and then around major policies, and then around kind of regulations that make sense. And I think often in this case, less is better. We can make it too complicated, and we shouldn't be putting a bunch of policies and regulations in place that we can't enable. We have a saying in A4NH that if 5% of the foods don't meet the standards, then those foods have a problem and need to be improved. But if 95% of foods don't meet standards, for example, which would happen if we applied EU standards for aflatoxins to a lot of our staples, then it's the standards who have a problem because people need to eat and things need to move on. So that's just a little bit on the kind of food side and some of the issues I see. In terms of the kind of the second part about safer and healthier foods, this relates to a lot of the discussions about convergence and how the public and private sector work. And I've been in lots of discussions in these over decades. And essentially this convergence between public and private views has a long way to go. It's quite clear that we will never deliver healthier and safer foods to people without the private sector in its various forms. That's clear, but it's not going well at present. And the private sector isn't very good at delivering healthier and safer foods, except for high income consumers and high value foods. They're not so good at it for lower income places and for the basic foods. And so my view is that there needs to be this collaboration between the public and private sector. And one of the classic kind of challenges at the moment on food systems is that there's this kind of discussion that food systems are broken in the world. And why people say that food systems are broken is because basically for most people, they don't work. If you look at the Eat Lancet diets that have been promulgated in the last couple of years, we've done some analysis in our programs that have shown that at least 3 billion people in the world can't afford anything close to those diets. And that's a huge problem and one that the public and private sector are going to have to work together on. And this, just to give a practical example from the continent, in East Africa, milk consumption is higher per capita, especially in countries like Kenya than it is in other places. But a lot of that is driven by informal markets and even marketing of unpasteurized food, which would be an anathema for kind of modern food systems. But that milk is half the price, it's consumed pretty quickly, et cetera. So it's working for now. It won't work 20 years from now. So it's figuring out the evolution of these standards and policies that are important and thinking about the welfare of our people as how that goes. So there's a lot of kind of convergence between the public and private sector that need to happen. And I'm glad to see this is moving ahead. Now, the kind of first question I was asked was kind of how is the nutrition and health agenda associated with agriculture progressed? What have we done perhaps well and what do we need to do better? So 3 things that I'm pleased about, I guess, over the last 10 years. One is that we adopted a food systems approach very early in A4H. We started with value chains and we realized that that wasn't going to be enough because we needed to look at food environments, at consumption, much more at the demand side than value chain analysis was giving. And so we've kind of moved on that 5 years ago, 6 years ago, and that's really helping us because we took a focus on kind of national food system transformation and supporting the ownership and leadership of countries in doing that. And I think that's been crucial. The other thing I'm quite pleased about is focusing on ag health linkages. And we talked about why that's important. And then another one that you've heard about in the first 2 webinars is the kind of scaling out of some of the technologies that we had, biofortification and AFLASAFE, and a lot of those. Now, that's part of the gaps, I think, is we did invest in kind of looking at innovation more systematically, which I think is important, but that needs to move on. So you heard from Mark Should on some of the early ideas about innovations, but I think there's a lot of opportunities for convergent innovation for the implementation of things in different contexts. So that's one gap. The second is the whole policy, cross-sectoral policy and enabling. And for me, it relates to the challenge of having country ownership and leadership because food system transformation is a national and subnational thing. It goes up to regional things, including African trade, but there really does need to be a convergence between the finance ministry, the planning ministry, and the national policy side, and what we want on the food systems for healthier and inclusive diets. And so I think that's another kind of gap, is that the linkages within countries and how we support that. So Julie, let me stop there. You gave me a lot of questions, so I hope I at least made a start in answering them.
Great. Hey, thanks a lot, John. I think, I'm grateful you've given us a kind of reality check we've got a lot of work to do to make convergence a reality. So ag and health sectors need to learn to talk to each other. The public and private sector need to talk to each other. So a lot of work, even though quite a lot of progress has been seen. And so thank you for putting us in the language of convergence and relating it back to your own work. So thank you for that. I'd like to now turn to Mrs. Elizabeth Nsemedala. She leads two important farmer organizations on the African continent. And we know that farmers and organizations are the bedrock of all food systems, of course. And I'd like you just to tell us in a thumbnail, just a minute about these two organizations, and then reflect on it, if you would. During the last days, we've talked a lot about the importance of the value proposition. Is the innovation profitable for farmers or companies? And I think this is a particularly critical question for the innovations we've been talking about, which involve additional investment by farmers, but in the past have not received a price premium in the market. So what does that look like now? The adoption of aflatoxin, the adoption of PICS bags, the adoption of biofortified crops. Are the incentives for farmer adoption there? Not. So where do you think we need to concentrate our efforts going forward? Elizabeth?
Yeah, thank you very much, Julie, and a big thank you to the organizers for inviting me and inviting farmers to be part of this webinar. Briefly, PAFO as a continental platform is a 10-year-old organization that was initiated by the African Union and represents voices of over 80 million smallholder family farmers from 49 countries. And these farmers belong to over 70 national farmers organizations, which are also members of our 5 regional networks. We are in every corner of the continent. In Southern Africa, we have SACAO. In Eastern Africa, we have Eastern Africa Farmers Federation, and PROPAC in the Central region, ROPA in West Africa, and UMNAGRI in Northern Africa, meaning the farmers of Africa are well represented under the regional farmers organizations. So back to
Elizabeth, we've lost the
Eastern Africa Farmers Federation, where I also Eastern Africa Farmers Federation is a regional farmers organization representing farmers from 10 Eastern African countries, and these are the 6 states of East Africa, plus Democratic Republic of Congo, Eritrea, Ethiopia, and Djibouti. And the membership are from cooperatives, national cooperatives, farmers associations, women and youth associations that are in all sectors of agriculture. And currently we represent over 20 million smallholder farmers. So back to the question that you've asked, whether we feel, there's value for additional investment by the farmers in terms of the price premium that is on the market, but also looking at it from the farmer's perspective on whether we feel these innovations are profitable for farmers or companies. I think from where we sit, we feel that as farmers, we have not been incentivized for making extra investments to produce high quality products. Because I think it has already been mentioned by the previous speakers that the African market is more of informal. It is really not structured. And we all know that most African countries are liberal. So everyone can come in and do whatever they want and just go away. And when you look at the trading that is happening in the region, middlemen and traders don't want to really pay an extra premium for the quality of product that is put on the market. They usually want to pay equal amount regardless of the quality, which is a very big demotivator for the farmers. When we look at the few companies that are viable, maybe I could speak of the Africa Improved Feeds. This is one of the companies that I've seen pay a price premium for aflatoxin-free maize and soya. And when we look at where they are operating, for example, in Rwanda, this has really motivated a majority of our farmers to invest in the practices that reduce contamination at farm level, but also at post-harvest level. So looking at the incentives that farmers have to use the PICS bags, growing the biofortified crops and producing commodities with low levels of aflatoxin, I think we need to understand that everything for farmers is really driven by the market and what buyers and consumers are willing to offer in terms of money. Because at the end of it all, yes, we go into farming, but at the end we are looking at what do we get from the farming that we are doing as an activity. So when you look at the incentives, they usually range from cost, the user friendliness, the effects of these to health and environment, but also more importantly on the return on investment. I want to appreciate that the fact that PICS bags are excellent at reducing storage losses, which of course is usually as a result of pests, of rodents. So we know most of our storage facilities are not up to standard. And also we can't underscore the microbial contamination, which of course also affects most of our grains. And when you look at the percentage of this whole storage loss, it usually ranges between 14 and 40% in most African countries. So you realize that most farmers use PICS bags because they are chemical-free storage facilities, they are user-friendly, they are cost-effective, they are safe, they are affordable. And they also stop the development of aflatoxin and preserve seed for a long time, because most of our farmers usually recycle seed that they've grown for one season, and use them for the next season. So they usually preserve this seed for a long time. But also when you look at their return on investment to the farmers, it is usually high. And farmers can also usually use them for a longer time, and this allows them to earn more from what they've produced, because they can at least store it for more time until the prices have realized a better price. So for the biofortified crops, of course, we see them as vehicles for delivering micronutrients. We all agree that these are very nutritious with health benefits, because we know they are rich in nutrients like, for example, when you look at the iron biofortified beans. So they have a potential to reduce malnutrition levels in our farming communities. And I think we all agree, it has already been mentioned that the malnutrition levels in Africa are very high and so alarming. And this is where we need to engage our smallholder farmers to adopt growing some of these biofortified crops. But where the challenge is on the awareness creation. I think farmers need to understand the benefits of these biofortified crops, so that, with this awareness creation, we can also as well increase the smallholder adoption of growing of such crops. But also when you look at the aflatoxin free crops, we know that they usually fetch a high market price. I've already mentioned the Africa Improved Feeds, for example. It's ready to pay an extra price premium for aflatoxin free soya and maize on the market, and many other companies that are in Africa and globally, which are ready to pay an extra fee for at least nutritious and health foods. So what are we doing as Eastern Africa Farmers Federation, and of course under our Pan-Africa Farmers Organization and the other regional farmers organizations? So we are trying as much as possible to continue, doing rigorous trainings for our memberships on most especially on the good agricultural practices. This is mainly where our focus is, and making sure that We train our farmers in quality management of the produce. And of course, when we are doing this, it usually facilitates our efforts to link to farmers to markets. No, and not only markets, but structured markets. We are talking of markets that have quality standard requirements that are known to everyone and that also offer price premiums, of course, which is one of our key mandates as a regional farmers organization. I usually say we are an aggregation of aggregations. So it's one reason we come together, aggregate ourselves to be able, to facilitate our farmers to access such kind of structured markets.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much. I hope I've tried to address some of the.
Clearly, we need a whole webinar with you in the future. So thank you a lot, and I really appreciate your examples from the farmer's point of view, right? They really need to see the benefits of the new technology, and they need to see it in their pocketbooks. So they're not going to get that in the informal markets. So these relationships with companies who are able to pay a premium for safe foods, for more nutritious foods, and establishing those linkages, and then establishing training, outreach and education of farmers to know how to meet those standards is really very important. So thank you so much for those insights. And I'm sorry we don't have more time to delve into the rest of your comments. Thank you. So now I'd like to turn to Mr. Ibrahim Garouza, who is the COO of Grow Africa. And Ibrahim, Grow Africa has perhaps the deepest experience on the continent working with private companies and investors to expand agricultural investment. And I'd like to ask you just to tell us very briefly about Grow Africa. And then I'm wondering if you could focus your comments on finance, which frankly didn't come up as much as I expected it would in the previous webinars, but we got a few questions ahead of this webinar that we're asking about finance, especially, how is it a big problem? How are we getting finance, especially to small and medium enterprises? We talk quite a bit in the webinars about government and donor investment, but we know the potential pool of private sector investment is much larger. So unlocking that is quite critical. So we had some questions come in about loan guarantees, blended capital. Are those relevant for SMEs, which we know are so pivotal in the food system? So over to you, Ibrahim, for about 6 minutes.
Okay, no, good. Thank you very much, Julie, and thank you for the opportunity. We all know the role of agriculture on the continent in Africa. In terms of its potential for GDP growth, its potential to absorb youth and tackle this issue of youth unemployment. We all know that agriculture needs investment if we want to transform our agriculture on the continent. And we all know also, and I'm not going to go into the data, we are all specialists here, so I'm sure you know the data. We all know that public sector doesn't have the kind of money which is required. We also know that the development partners funding, it's not at a level which it was before. So where is the money? The money is with the private sector. But how do we get private sector to invest into agriculture in the continent? I'm very, very happy to elaborate this afternoon on a unique model which has been developed by Grow Africa, a program of the African Development Agency, AUDA NEPAD. And through this business model, and I will get to the numbers at the end of my presentation, we've been able to really have some great successes in some African countries. So how do we get private sector to invest into agriculture on the continent? So through this business model of Grow Africa, we think that it's very important to connect all the actors of the ecosystem. So we start by setting up what we call a multi-stakeholder platform. African countries have identified in the Agricultural Development Plan priority agricultural value chains. So when we get into a country, we select one or two value chains and we set up a platform. A platform will bring all the actors of the value chain: production, processing, transformation, distribution, and even the development partners. Why do we do so? We think that it's only by bringing all the actors of the value chain that we can discuss and identify the problems of the particular value chain and the solutions which we can implement together. So once we have set up a platform, then we conduct a business case study along the value chain, where we will identify all the segments, along the segment of the value chain, what are the commercial opportunities for private sector investment. So as we speak, as Grow Africa, we have set up multi-stakeholder platform in the rice value chain in Cote d'Ivoire, in the pineapple value chain in Benin, in the cassava value chain in Nigeria, in the potato value chain in Kenya, soya bean in Mozambique, just to name a few. So once we have set up the platform and conducted a business case study, and then we know where are the commercial opportunities for private sector to invest, then we do the matchmaking. And matchmaking is where we showcase those commercial opportunities for private sector investors. And when we say private sector, we mean domestic and international. So once those commercial opportunities are presented to private sector investors and there's an appetite to invest, then as Grow Africa, we facilitate the signing of PPPs or term sheets, where all parties to a particular investment come together, commit to a certain set of actions in order to have the investment happening. So as we speak, in the last 2 years, through this business model, we as Grow Africa have managed to mobilize $500 million of private sector investment in 7 African countries and in 8 priority value chains in those countries. So we think also as Grow Africa that in order to scale this business model, in order to reach the maximum impact we are looking at, we need partners. So whatever we'll be discussing as experts in terms of innovation, access to technology or access to finance, and I'll come back to that to answer your question, Julie, it needs to land somewhere. So where can it land? It can land into those multi-stakeholder platforms, because that's where we can capacitate the smallholder farmers, and that's where we can connect our smallholder farmers to the commercial supply chain. And it's only in capacitating and empowering our smallholder farmer that we will be able to transform our agriculture in Africa. Now you ask a question, Julie, on access to finance. Of course, we facilitate the signing of PPPs or term sheets, or where all parties to an investment come together and commit to a set of action in order to make the investment happening. But we have realized rather, as Grow Africa, that in most cases, to turn those commitments into real investment deals, we need finance. We need access to finance, and I will even call it innovative finance. So what is innovative finance? And wherever we go, wherever we are invited to speak to development partners or financial institutions, be it commercial or development finance institutions, we say that whatever we are trying to set up as financing models need to take into account the needs of the actors of the multi-stakeholder platforms. Because we are quick to say, no, we've put up this facility, but the money cannot be spent and so forth and so on. But in most cases, it's because the facility is put in place without taking into account the needs of the beneficiaries. So access to innovative finance is that we put together a mechanism by taking into account the needs of the actors. That's where we will be sure that the monies or the facilities will be spent efficiently. So let me pause here, and then I'm sure I will come back and answer a few questions if needs be. Thank you very much, Julie.
Thank you very much, Ibrahim. And I think you've, in your remarks and the importance of the platform for communication between the public and private sector, you've nicely set up our next speaker, who is Dr. Jonas Ciano, who I'm also going to ask to talk about the ecosystem and the problems that John and many others have raised in the communication issues, the conversion, pulling all of these actors together. So, Jonas, you lead the Technologies for African Agricultural Transformation Program, which is just central to achieving African Development Bank's commitment to transforming agriculture on the continent. And I want to thank you for your keynote address yesterday, and note that folks can turn to that for a very comprehensive overview of TAT, what it's doing, especially related to food safety and nutrition. So I want to ask you, as I understand it, a main reason that TAT was created was to focus on building what are sometimes radical partnerships and connecting the dots throughout the food system. So can you expound a little bit more on that? How is TAT helping to create and sustain the ecosystem in its programs that are directly related to food safety and nutrition? And these are policy and regulatory investments focused on high iron beans and aquaculture and livestock. And so as you look back over TAT's experience, and we talked about how you're about to go into planning for phase 2, how have these efforts evolved over time? And what do you think might want to do differently in phase 2 than phase 1? So, Jonas, thank you very much. Over to you, about 6 minutes.
Okay, thank you very much, Julie, and also thank the organizers of this event for inviting us to present some issues on TAT. I will structure my responses just according to the way you have framed the questions. First, I will talk about how TAT is helping to create and sustain the ecosystems of diverse partners. And I will use the cases of high iron bean compact, the aquaculture compact, and livestock compact. So it'll illustrate how the ecosystem works and addresses food safety and nutrition. Then the next stanza will be on the efforts, how the efforts has evolved over time. And then I'll go for recommendations. Yes, indeed. In relation to the African Development Bank's Feed Africa strategy and overall development of Africa, the main reason why TAT was created was to focus on building critical and all-embracing partnerships of all relevant stakeholders that usher in sustainable development of its target agricultural commodities following a value chain approach. TAT is helping to sustain the ecosystem of diverse partners in its program that are directly related to food safety and food nutrition through component 2 of the program, which is on regional technology delivery infrastructure, especially its second arm, which is commodity technology delivery compact. And this is actually the core of TAT itself. The commodity technology delivery compact is an agreement among the entire ecosystem of actors needed to deliver technologies at scale for specific commodity value chain. It is like an innovation platform, and it is hosted by the CG centers or institutions with the mandate for the target commodities. Now, focusing on the high iron bean, the livestock and aquaculture compacts, let me illustrate how the ecosystem works. And I start first with the high iron bean. The high iron bean is working with all the relevant stakeholders along the value chain and focuses on disseminating biofortified bean varieties, biofortified to increase iron and zinc content, and high yielding varieties and good agricultural practices. Beans are major and affordable sources of protein, minerals, and fiber and vitamins. The iron and bean and zinc help to reduce anemia, especially in women of reproductive ages. Also to reduce impaired physical and mental development, delayed maturation, poor appetite, and so on and so forth. The compact is raising awareness about these benefits among the stakeholders in the target countries, including advocacy to policymakers to include high iron bean in its development programs. Farming communities are also being encouraged to improve their diets by consuming more of high iron beans. the compass is addressing safety issues by beans by engaging with country Bureau of Standards with an aim to build the capacity of processors in meeting the quality standards of processed bean products to penetrate new markets. The compact is also backstopping private sector enterprises to develop and commercialize nutritious value-added bean products like pre-cooked beans and bean-based flour mills. Now, with respect to the aquaculture compact, it is working again with the relevant compact, that's the larger ecosystem, and it has been working on creating awareness on food safety concerns along the value chain to actors from the fish production to fish consumption. And this includes hazards analysis, critical control point of the production, and value addition and inspection of fish and fisheries products. Fish diseases surveillance are conducted in certain countries like Ghana, and then they are trying to deploy exactly nutrition-sensitive technologies that have reduced post-harvest losses through value addition and fish product development. Examples include the smoking claim that reduces exposure to smoke and fire and easy to operate and has achieved a low polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbon. And then the next one is the solar tent dryer that it doesn't avoid the use of charcoal, but produces high quality and sand-free processed fish, which is an economically viable business. This has increased availability, accessibility, and consumption of nutrients essential for cognitive and physical development, especially in children between the age of 0 and 5 years, and pregnant women also. And then the compact is also embarking on outreach programs to create awareness on the nutritional value of fish, and is working to domesticate regional fish policies, regulations of food safety and enforcement with the regional, with the RECs, regional economic communities. With respect to the livestock compact, the objective is to increase productivity and profitability of livestock value chains through upscaling relevant innovations. With working with the partners, it works across the entire value chain of poultry, cattle, and small ruminants, sheep and goat, and then in appropriate agri-ecosystems to scale up technologies that are more efficient in livestock production. And it works on policy and pathways through which to increase livestock consumption at household level through school feeding or the sales of livestock products for income to buy food, as well as in addressing foodborne diseases and improving food safety along the informal livestock value chains. The role of animal source foods in healthy diets is key part of achieving nutritional and food security objectives. The livestock products contribute to human development by improving the well-being of pregnant and lactating women, promoting development of infants and children, and thus enhancing the brain power of nations while supporting family food security, nutrition, and incomes. Now, how are these things have evolved over time? Now, increasing knowledge of existing gaps and continuous efforts to fill these, we are like what we have seen in the case of high iron bean, how they are bringing in the private partners to be able to also help them with some of the new technology to produce pre-cooked beans. And then increasing the engagement of more relevant institutions like the Country Bureau of Standards with the aim of building the capacity of processors in meeting quality standards of processed foods. And of course, helping to backstop the private sector enterprises to develop and commercialize nutrition value-added products. Then the recommendations for the future will be, there is need to continue to search for and bring into that ecosystem new partners that have value addition to make in addressing the choke points along the different commodity value chains. And of course, there is need to use early lessons learned during implementation in modifying the program for improved and sustainable delivery. I think I can stop at this point this time. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Jonas. And again, I think you're doing a great job with Ibrahim of setting up the conversation in the next panel. I think, both TAT and Grow Africa, are really important examples of intermediary organizations who are really dedicated to connecting the dots, to unleash private sector investment and especially for TOT, yeah, building bridges between private sector and public sector and liaising very, very closely with government on policies and regulations. So thank you for that. So with that, we're running dramatically short of time here. And apologies, Abdu, I failed in my job as a moderator. But let me turn quickly to our second panel here, our panel of development partners, to talk about the role of development partners in advancing food safety, nutrition, and food systems transformation. So we've got with us 3 senior representatives from development partners who've long been engaged in advancing ag, food, and nutrition security. So I'm going to introduce them briefly, and then I'm going to pose a slate of 3 questions, and then I'm going to invite them to respond to any and all of them in a very succinct manner. So our panelists are Mr. Mark Huizinga, who is a senior program manager at USAID and has long been engaged in steering scaling efforts in agriculture. We also have Mr. Rafael Flor, who is a senior program officer for inclusive markets and agricultural development at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. And we have Mr. Guillaume Alicia Roba, who is a regional technical advisor for EFAD. So let me just state my 3 questions, and then I'm going just to ask any of you to take a stab at responding to them. And of course, you're the final panel, so the burden on all of you is to sort of reflect on what we've heard over the past 3 days and this morning, and think about for us, what do you think the implications are for future design and future investment by development partners? So here are my 3 rapid fire questions. First, evidence is piling up rapidly about poor diets and foodborne illnesses as the leading contributor to mortality around the world. And many of the innovations we've been discussing are minor investments, really path breakers, outliers. They're important, but such a small proportion of the overall research investment. So why do you think it's been so important to so difficult to increase public and private investment in innovations around reducing food waste, improving food safety, and improving nutrition? So that's question 1. The second question, reflecting on the issues and opportunities that have been raised during the webinars and today in Laurette's talk, what role do you think donor and investment partners can play in modeling and encouraging more and more effective investment in food waste and nutrition, improving nutrition? So I'm particularly struck by the emphasis yesterday and today by Laurette on the role of data, evidence-based standards, and outreach and communication as critical to creating markets and shifting consumer investment behavior. And finally, we've talked repeatedly through this week about the importance of having space to pivot models as the evidence comes in. Larry Cooley talked about that on the first day. The importance of ongoing adaptation of innovation needed to meet market needs, adapting PICS bags to other commodities besides cowpeas, for example. So I think, in the COVID crisis, nowhere has the need to pivot been more obvious than the sort of dramatic response that's been required from market systems, market players during COVID. So, as you know, that's been a point of contention between donors and implementers. That oftentimes it seems very rigid, the project structure. And so, what do you think donors and funders can do to create more space to pivot while maintaining program quality and accountability? So now I'd like to open the floor to these three panelists and call on whomever to speak first to one or all of these questions. So Mark, you've turned your camera on, so I'm going to assume that you are going to jump into the fray first, and thank you.
Why not, Julie? Thank you very much. So I'll address particularly the first question because that's the one that struck me the most in the last couple of days. I'll start off just by saying in USAID's experience, it's important to understand the extent to which markets will pull an innovation or if the innovation has to be pushed. So many of the innovations we've supported don't always have a straight commercial pathway to scale. And this is where donors can and have played a role. In such cases, it's critical to assess the nature of the constraints. So are they constraints in supply or are they constraints in demand? We found ourselves that There's different institutional arrangements that are needed to address supply constraints versus demand constraints. With respect to pull factors, we have found that these can be strengthened through strategies such as bundling. That is by combining innovative technologies with improved practices and products. And with respect to the pivot issue, sometimes we have to try multiple ways of bundling. With AFLISAFE, for example, it would be possible that we could bundle AFLISAFE with better soil management practices, or in the case of biofortified crops, to bundle them into ingredients for food ingredients markets. I mean, we have to think creatively and be open-minded and opportunistic. With respect to scaling innovations and some of the constraints we've come across, I'd say they roughly fall into 6 different categories, and it's important to understand them. In the first case, we need to really delineate the right market and make sure it's aligned with the right business model. This isn't always obvious. So, for example, with AFLISAFE, we've seen the need to revisit and reconfigure the business model. And it may be still that we have to have a bundled traceability system to preserve the market premium for the treated products. Or in another case I'm familiar with, there was an innovative solar vegetable dryer, but the entrepreneur unfortunately defined the market as dried vegetable exports for exporters. And so the solar dryer maybe had a total of 30 or 40 buyers in the market, potential buyers. And it was just that the market was defined too small. It would have been much better to have gone back and redesigned the vegetable dryer to have wheels, make it mobile, and it might have been more attractive to would-be small entrepreneurs. Another category that is important to consider is how obvious is the solution. So if we're looking at a bag for storing grain, well, that's quite obvious. But understand that a solution that involves a moisture meter means 13.5% moisture content. If we're going to sell grain further in the market, that's a more difficult proposition. Or explaining aflatoxins in soil, that's also, it's not an obvious problem to a farmer. A third category is ease of use, or is it plug and play? A seed is plug and play, a solar water pump isn't. Business cases, they really have to be clear. We have to see how there's going to be a profit, but also there's a whole market systems case that we've come to appreciate more over time, so that the broader market system also has to make money on a new innovation, or it could cost them money. Likewise, there might be threatened entrenched interests in a market system. So these are important factors to consider, along with the enabling environment, which we discussed yesterday. With respect to standards, I'll just echo something John McDermott said earlier about setting standards. If we set standards too onerously, we're going to create gray markets. And that's not going to serve farmers, and it's really not going to serve the country well over time. Just in the context of COVID, I will say that USAID has really focused on deploying digital tools because it's become such a critical part of infrastructure to reach our beneficiaries more. And also it's become really clear the importance of real-time data. And so that's another area we've been focusing on is to get more accurate, more timely information. And with that, I will stop.
Okay. Thanks, Mark. That's great. Those are great insights and gives an idea of what it's like to be in a donor's shoes and looking at a lot of the same problems that we've been discussing through the week, and your thoughts about that. So thank you. So Gio or Raphael, who would like to jump in next with comments?
Perhaps I can go
Raphael?
next, and
Yeah.
then, yeah. No,
Thank
thank you, Julie. And thank you for the kind invitation.
You're a little bit faint.
Sorry, can you hear me now? Is it better?
Yes, yeah, I think, great,
Okay.
thank you.
No, I was just, good morning, everyone. Good afternoon. Thank you for the kind invitation. A few reflections on the questions that you posed, Julie. In the case, and let me focus on our experience with the PEAKS bags. What it was interesting in the case of the PEAKS bags is that, the project was conceived as, from a research perspective, as solving a challenge, but it was not conceived as, there is a market for a solution. And I think that has critical implications, right? I mean, the problem that we were trying to solve was there is a lot of grain going to waste, rather than, there is a market for better storage and for with health benefits, right? So as you go into this journey, what we learn is that the real market, at least in Tanzania, was women getting grain without pesticides for health reasons, which was a great insight. I mean, there is a market for what we are doing, right? But we are not understanding, going to Mark's point, what is the business case? And then, of course, you have to solve all these different, challenges. And we take it also from a research perspective. So the first thing was like, let us make sure that the science behind it is right? So let us start to test all these different layers. Let us test these different designs. Let us, get it to the field, and we'll solve the other problems later on. But of course, you have to think about manufacturing. You have to think about distribution channels. You need to think about finance. And of course, it needs to be consumer centric. And the consumer comes towards the end. Is that does this solve and serve the purpose of the consumer, right? So again, I think, perhaps starting to think and switching the framing, starting with the consumer, starting with what the market need is, starting with what, is there a demand for that product first, before even, thinking about the technological solution in a way. And in the case of pigs, the other interesting part that we learned was that the distribution channels were completely different. You buy, bags for maize in the hardware store, not with the agro dealers. That is the way that the bags are distributed in these African markets. It's the same polypropylene bag that you use for cement or for carrying, other materials. So, you start to think about all these different intricacies of the different markets, and that makes it even more complex. Now, to your question about food loss and food waste, and I'll stop after that. When we were working on food loss and food waste at the Rockefeller Foundation, what we found that was really interesting was that what you cannot measure, you cannot, solve for, right? So in the case of food loss and food waste, what is happening is that it's being considered as part of the business. It's part of the bottom line. You add it as an extra cost. It's not visible to anybody, and hence, you don't solve for that challenge. And once you start to get those numbers visible, you realize that it's so much money. And that's the other challenge that we have, is that the food is so cheap that you can add that as an extra cost because you don't include any externalities, right? But when you bring those costs to light and start to add externalities, you realize that number is extremely high. It's $1 trillion. It's 1% of the global economy every single year that we lose on food loss and food waste. And that is without including some of the externalities. So with the work with the Rockefeller Foundation, what it was interested is like, first, how do we make this visible? How do you start to measure that? And once you start to measure, what can companies and the private sector has taken the lead on this, can do to reduce their costs? And you see that, from retailers like Tesco, where in their supermarkets, as soon as they started to measure it, they were able to identify specific segments and introduce innovations to reduce that loss. So in our cases, in terms of the farmer, it would be a little bit more difficult, and the numbers, vary. For horticulture products, the loss is really high. And what we learned is that we needed to identify where those losses happen and what kind of technologies could solve for those problems. In the case of, to give you an example, in the case of tomatoes in the north of Nigeria, most of the losses happen in transport between the North Kano or Kaduna, where the tomatoes are produced, and the market in Lagos. And the main loss was because you didn't have the crates, the plastic stackable crates. So they were transported in these raffia baskets, piled one on top of the other. And of course, you're going to have high losses, right? So identifying those segments, being able to measure, and identifying those technologies that could solve those problems it became extremely, extremely important. So let me stop there. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Yeah,
so-
just thank you for having us in this conversation. I think a lot has been said by my colleagues. I will add very few points from my experience. What I think is the biggest challenge is how innovations are piloted and how they're documented and how they're utilized. And that I think is the biggest issue. For us, I think within IFAD also and outside IFAD, a lot of information and knowledge generated from the projects at the country levels are not easily accessible. So what happened, if it's not accessible, then adoption, utilization, using it in the future designs of the project, etc., is lost. So I think just as an example, when we saw that, we took initiative last year, I think, using this COVID restriction to document what we call catalog of innovations within our projects. And I think there are quite a number of them. So we had to have a criteria for reducing them. So we have almost 70 innovations within our project that none of us in the region, most of us don't even know they exist. So what happened is that you lost that completely in utilizing it in the country, in influencing policies, in shifting investment. So if you don't use that information, then investment is sort of skewed in one direction. I think that one has to be an important focus if you want to, I think, shift investment in a different direction. Secondly, I think in our design, because I think within IFAD, we have the lending activities, which is 90% of our investment, and then the 10% is non-lending activity. And how the two complement each other is very important. Lending activity is a bit structured because countries ask for what they want. We have little influence over that. But I think non-lending activities, which we do research, pilot innovations, test, scale up, we do with CGI centers like ILRI, CIAT, and CIMIT and others. So this is a very good opportunity where we manage to do a little bit of innovation testing. But I think still we have a long way to go, because I think it still goes back to that long lag between successful innovation tested and widespread adoption. And I think to bridge that, one has to go back into the design. How do you bring a private sector who has potential for spreading these innovations, adoption of it, maybe working on the cost, lowering the cost from the original cost? Mostly all innovations have a bit, I think, most promising innovations have a cost factor to it. It's a bit cost intensive, as such, not accessible to small and micro enterprises, which are very common within agricultural sector. So they have profitability issue, they have working capital issue, and all these things has to come together when we design the investment. And I think this is the important thing that I have to mention on the first question. Quickly on the second part, what we did, I think we try to look at how do we shape our investment from the beginning in terms of how do we influence countries to invest in nutrition, in an aspect that we want, I think, which are very important we're discussing today. So in IFAD, what we do is we have something called Country Opportunity Strategic Program, which is called COSOP. COSOP is high-level investment framework that brings countries' goals, aspirations on the table. So, and it is point at which different stakeholders, both state and non-state actors, consult and have a conversation. And this is, I think, the best point to where you entrench nutrition and all aspects that are very important for investment. And I think we have done to a certain level within IFAD, but it's still very much evolving, because at corporate level we have these nutrition sensitive, goal or compliance, which most project has to meet, I think, for the last 2 years, and it has worked in a way, but it's still very evolving, because the way we are meeting is they're trying to put them as a cross-cutting issues, spreading them across investment in crop, livestock, fisheries. But I think the way to go is to make sure that you influence investment and how the investment are split at that level and downwards, going downwards. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So maybe we have time for just one round of responses, and I'll take the prerogative with my own question. So as you're talking, especially Mark and Raphael, about finding the value proposition, about and Guillaume, about supporting the market, for new innovations, it strikes me that with food safety and nutrition and food waste, you've got sort of an extra layer of challenges, right? I mean, so as Elizabeth was telling us, most farmers are selling into the informal market. They're definitely not getting a premium for aflatoxins. So there's the added sort of layer of it's a normative layer, right? I mean, you have to create a new kind of market, or facilitate the creation of new demand for aflatoxin-free products or for biofortified. So I think, to me, that's something that maybe has really held back investment in this sector. And I'm wondering if you have any sort of just sentence comments about anything that you've learned or anything that you could say to guide us in the future.
Perhaps I can start and then, yeah. I think, from our experience, and we have these discussions internally every so often, because, from my perspective, I think we need to distinguish between the existing market and creating a new market and servicing the existing. So for me, the low hanging fruit is, how do we service the existing market? There is a market already for, aflatoxin-free maize. So now the question is, how can we serve that market at that cost that the market has for that product? And then there is the other one. How do you increase the demand of that product? And that's more on the marketing side. And I have this challenge with my colleagues all the time, because it's like, for me, we are the markets team. We are not the marketing team. And I think, that tension is important, right? I mean, we need to understand, in the case of Sub-Saharan Africa, the point that I have been making internally is that there is a large existing market for nutrient-rich foods already. If you start to look at the numbers and the trends, there is a very large market that's not being served. Mm-hmm. So it's not a question of creating a new market. It's a question of servicing that market at the current prices. Now, whether we can do that is a different question altogether, right? Mm-hmm. And I think, you have similar challenges with food loss, with aflatoxin, with PICS bags or hermetic bags, and all of these new technologies that they are serving a purpose. But let me allow Mark and Guillaume to comment on that as well. Over.
Just to push back for 1 second, Raphael, I can see that there's an existing market, but I worry that that's the high-end supermarkets, it's the high-end restaurants. I mean, we see the same thing in my own country, in the US. So sort of the extra challenges, how is consumer demand elevated, in lower income, in middle income? How are those foods made much more available? How is demand created through perhaps some of the institutional feeding programs that we heard about yesterday, through school feeding? So one last word from Mark and Guillaume, and then unfortunately we'll have to move to close out our session.
Well, it is a challenge, isn't it? And it's one that a lot of the more advanced economies haven't been able to solve. So It's not going to necessarily be an easy problem to solve for sub-Saharan Africa, for instance. So, but there are things that we have learned, partly around just the importance of socializing information, getting it out there, and reaching populations more effectively than has been the case in the past. It's also important that, yes, okay, we've got, say, aflatoxin-free maize or groundnuts, and it creates it has a premium of, I think I heard 15%. What's going to happen to that premium over time? One thing we've seen with commodity markets over and over again is the premiums get squeezed, and eventually the farmers lose the premium that they have, and then they lose their incentive. So it is important to be able to find a way, and cost effectively, because we need traceability in the system, and it's got to be the cheapest traceability system possible if we're going to be able to keep that premium, preserve the premium, and try to keep it for the farmer as well, so that as volumes increase, the premium doesn't entirely dissipate. So that's a challenge we have looking ahead.
Okay, thank you. Guillaume, last word to you.
Yeah, thank you so much. I think it's exactly what my colleagues have said. The market segmentation and how to meet different market segmentation is a big issue within, I think, sub-Saharan Africa. But I think there is hope, and the hope is, I think, is in terms of how do we address the basic, the production constraints. How do you address these production constraints so that you expand the production base of the desired product? What we have done, I think, in our Kenya Cereal Enhancement Program, KSE project, is to bring a little bit of innovation. We look at all the production constraints, and there are around 7 of them, from the high quality seeds, training, market aggregation, and etc. And I think what we have done is to have a bit of smart subsidy through a Visa card. The Visa card is a customized card which has different wallet, and each wallet, I think, has a limit for each farmers. I think 2,000 shilling, 20 euro per wallet. Maybe 7 wallet is 140 euro. What happened, I think, in this particular innovation is that a farmer has to put in certain percent at the beginning, and then they graduate as they move on to full commercialization and production. The benefit of this particular approach is that you combine the production agronomic training with the market, because it's from the production to the market. And in that, I think you have a good learning curve in terms of what kind of products are produced, what is the market characterization looking like, what are the market segments, and how do you align this product to a different market. And I think farmers will get this feedback, and which is really missing in this region is the feedback, the market information, which feedback to the producers to shape their production to meet certain demand along the value chain. Thank you.
Thank you, Guillaume, for reminding us of the importance of the tools that we now have to facilitate that kind of buying and demand for more nutritious and safe food. So thank you for that. Well, I'd like to thank all of our panelists. So for a really wonderful, rich discussion. I feel like we've just scratched the surface on so many topics, and I'm looking forward to continuing the discussion in the scaling community of practice. There we have a working group on agriculture and rural development. We have a regular webinar series. So don't be surprised if many of you find invitations in your mailboxes to come and speak to us further about some of the topics you've covered with us today. So thanks again. And now we're really moving into our closing session. And I'd like to ask whether we have Dr. Fadel Ndiame with us. Yes, we do. Okay.
Yes, Julie, I'm here.
Yes, Dr. Ndiame is Deputy President of the Alliance for a Green Revolution in Africa, which has been very focused on scaling and has been an important partner with us through the years in elevating and trying to solve some of the big scaling challenges we face. So please, Fadel, we're so happy to have you with us. Could you give us a few reflections to close out our session? Thank you.
Thanks so much, Julie. And I want to thank the panelists, some of our friends from our Piata platform, Raphael, Mark, and others. it's really a pleasure for me to address this important webinar. And I'm doing this on behalf of my boss, Dr. Agnes Kalibata, the president of Agric. So I have one major key concluding remark that I want to share very quickly, and then provide 5 key points around which it is built based on the learning and the key highlight of this very important webinar. But before doing that, I want to thank again the organizer for a surprising and amazing webinar. We learn a lot. We are very happy to participate and look forward to the next steps. So the key message I take from this, Judy and colleagues, is that COVID-19, which is part of our reality today, the context, reminded us of the need to rethink and rebuild our food system. Now, in that context, it's clear from this discussion that innovation, taken broadly speaking, technical, institutional, and policy innovation will have to play a central role in this collective venture. But what we learned from this discussion is that these innovation, the innovation trajectories that we are all hoping for and working towards, should be human-centered and designed as part of a system that sit at the intersection between health, economy, and environment. I think the presentation of Professor Dube was quite refreshing in reminding us about the importance of the issue, but also the complexity of the issue. So it's going to be crucial. I was particularly impressed by all the discussion and the conclusion of this 3 days webinar. But I think it's around that challenge that the outcome of this meeting will link us more strategically to the upcoming UN Food System Summit, especially around the outcome of providing healthy food for all in a sustainable way. And a footnote would be the last discussion between Raphael and Mark around food, whether it is the market, with market driven, or etc. I think the real imperative is healthy food for all sustainably. So that's the key message, the key takeaway. Now, this was built on some of the key highlights that I was particularly interested in listening to this discussion. The first is the sense of urgency. I think we were reminded during the discussion that considering the nature of the challenges that we are facing, we don't have a luxury to continue to let technology sit on the shelf for such a long time. I think Abdul has highlighted it several times. There is a significant risk of obsolescence due to climate change, for one thing, and other parameters. So the case for scaling and doing it quickly is extremely important. However, I think we should also resist what I call a supply side populism. We should do this having in mind, keeping our focus on the final customer, the farmer, and look them in early in the innovation journey in a circular look and not in a linear approach. And the reason for that is we are dealing with a very heterogeneous constituency operating in a very dynamic environment. Again, I want to reference the brilliant presentation by Professor Dube. Let's go fast, but let's keep an eye, let's bring on board all the voices to make sure that what we're doing speak to what they need and what they can afford. The second point is we need, in that context, to recognize that we need to improve our understanding of the practice of scaling. And Judith, thank you for reminding us of this practice. I think many of us will sign up to it. I think from the discussion today, we realize how complex, but how important this whole scaling enterprise is. But at the same time, I think we're also very clear that we can leverage on the digital revolution and the digital platform and infrastructure to enable us to fast track the process and shorten the 15 years shelf life between the development of the technology to this adoption. I think it has been very clearly articulated by Dr. Cooley and others. How can we use technology to fast track it and do it in a more efficient way? Third point is, regardless of the innovation that we are dealing with, we have to take a systemic approach as we are considering it, recognizing that we are dealing with both public and private actors. One of the things that is very clear as we talk about norm, regulation, etc., the role of government is becoming extremely important, especially in the context of food safety and nutrition-related innovation. Therefore, our capability to engage both the public and the private sector will be crucial in informing the way we succeed, we embark in this journey. I think this came very, very important during this discussion. Fourth point is the role of intermediation and accountability. I mean, I think it struck me especially during day one, how significant this role of orchestration to make sure that this ecosystem is managed, orchestrated in a way that is consistent with a win-win outcome. And the discussion clearly highlighted the need to have the right set of funding and expertise so that this function continue to be performed in the short and the long term. The role and responsibility in the intermediation will evolve as a new challenge emerge. And I think as part of that, building trust is going to be crucial in making sure that that ecosystem is managed properly. And my final point I want to base my recommendation on, my final thought is, we need new financing tool. It was very clear that the nature of the challenges require a new financing architecture that will combine and blend philanthropy money, private sector investment, traditional donor, impact investment, private equity, etc. I think the language of blended finance for me matches with the languages of convergence that was at the heart of this discussion. So with these few remarks, Judy and colleague, I want to thank you again for inviting us and look forward to the next step of this amazing conversation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Fidel. That was really an amazing job of crystallizing the lessons, not only from today, but from the entire webinar series. So really appreciate that, the extra food for thought that you've given us. So finally, last but very certainly not least, I'd like to turn over the podium to Dr. Abdou Konlambige, who is the Managing Director of the AfloSafe Technology Program at IATA. But very importantly, he has also been the lead organizer for the 3 scaling webinars this week. Abdou, I would like to congratulate you and thank you, for putting together such a group of exciting speakers. I think we've had wonderful conversations this week. Would you please close us out with a few remarks?
Thank you, Julie, for a great facilitation, and thank you for that, and thank you for the panelists. I think the main objective of this session, when we're putting it together, and I think Marcella and myself, I think the objective of this session really was to figure out the best way.
You're on mute, Abdou.
Can you hear me?
Yes, now. Yes, thank you.
Okay, sorry for that. So I think one of the key things that we want to learn, from the different kind of actors that we have in this room, I think from what I've heard from Fidel, there's little I can add about that. I think we need to learn about that. Before we move on, I think one of the things that I would like all of us to do, and probably in this room to check what we have learned so far, during the 3 days event. And I would like to, as we are moving, for the closing remarks, and I think my colleague will send this in the chat box. And I would like to ask each one of you and the most important takeaway. And I think Raphael and Mark, they provide their takeaway, Fidel as well. But I think I would like to hear from all of you the major takeaways, from this webinar series. I think my role, I think on behalf of the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and IITA, is really to thank all our partners. I think we didn't put this together alone. We have the Purdue University, Harvest Plus, Agric, the Agriculture for Food, the CGR program on agriculture for nutrition and health, and the McGill Center for Convergence of Health and Economy, and with Professor Dube, and also Godan. I would like to thank them for all the support that we received to prepare this session. But I would like also, as we are talking, I think throughout the journey, we mentioned again the issue about intermediation and so on. I would like to share with you also, and I think as in our journey for AFLA, the issue about the market assessment, the issue about the segmentation, and our journey to play this intermediation role, we've tried to document them. And I think there are four guides that, I think we'll share the link in the box and with all the participants, where the way we address the issue of market assessment, the issue of investor selection, and how do we structure the relationship with the private sector, and all the question IP, question that we receive in the box, and how do we do that, and how do we engage them in implementation, and how are they navigating through their journey. I think we believe that this guide also will help us to share our experience and some of the shortfalls that we identify in our journey. We have also, series of country status report to give an idea. The countries are so different, and the level of the market, the level of awareness about aflatoxin issues, and the level of the private sector development, and the issue about the niche market, and the appetite and the knowledge of the different actors about the issue were different. So you'll see that there are different ways the technology is being commercialized in different countries. And I think this country status report will give you an idea of the next step that we identify. I think we are very happy that some of the issues that we identify were highlighted also in this 3 days webinar. To finish, and I would like to thank, starting with, Julie, and all the great facilitators that we had during the last 3 days, Aggie from Agra, Garon from Chemonix, and Julie today. They were very excellent and bringing the best from the audience. I would like to thank also all the the panelists, and I know we need to do things better. I think the gender balance was not really maintained, and I think I promise, and with all our partners, we'll do our best to try to balance this in our next engagement. And I think this is a promise, and I will do that. And last but not the least, I think I would like really for us to our appreciation, a big applaud for these people that were working behind the scene over the last 2 months, and to really make this happen. And Jerry supporting the communication, Tunde managing the platform, and ensuring that the registration and everything goes well. You have Diana in the logistics. I'm sure that you've been interacting with Diana, all over, the last few weeks. We have Kachi Lopez also, the head of communication, ensuring that things goes well, and Dominic, behind the scene, providing support to the entire team, and in terms of the content, and also in terms of reporting. And I would like to thank them very much for all the things they have done. And yes, thank you very much. And now we can look at the result of the poll. I don't know if it's finished. Tunde, you can show it for the audience, and I think after that we are done. Thank you very much. Yeah, so it's growing, and Julie and all of thank you very much, and we'll make sure that we put all the material on the web page and to download, and the proceedings also will be shared with the different participants. Okay, bye-bye.